The river was moving fast. The storm had made the water rise, turning it into a dangerous, rushing force. A little boy was trapped in it, struggling to stay above the surface. His small hands reached out, his mouth open to scream, but the water pulled him under again. There was no one nearby to help. No one even saw him. Except Thunder. The injured racehorse stood in his field, ears up, eyes locked on the boy. He could hear the splashing, the choking gasps. His body tensed. His racing days were over. His leg still hurt from an old injury. He wasn't the strong champion he used to be. But none of that mattered now. Before anyone could stop him, Thunder took off. His hooves slammed against the wet ground as he raced toward the fence. He didn't hesitate. He didn't slow down. He jumped, just like he had in his best races. And then, he was free, running straight for the river. This is the story of how an injured racehorse became a hero. Thunder was not always like this. There was a time when he was the fastest horse on the track. People came from all over to watch him run. His black coat shined under the stadium lights. His muscles moved like a machine built for speed. He was the pride of his trainers, the favorite of the crowds. Every time the gates opened, he shot forward like a bullet. He didn't just run, he flew. His hooves barely touched the ground. Other horses tried to keep up, but they never could. Thunder always finished first. His owners loved him, at least when he was winning. He was their golden ticket, the horse that made them rich. His jockey trusted him more than any other. There was a connection between them, an unspoken understanding. They moved as one, pushing harder, chasing victory. But then, everything changed. It was a championship race, the biggest of the season. Thunder was the favorite to win. The starting bell rang, and as always, he took off, faster than anyone else. The crowd roared. His jockey leaned forward, urging him on. The finish line was close. Just a few more strides. Then, disaster struck. Thunder felt a sharp pain shoot through his leg. His speed suddenly turned into stumbling. His powerful stride collapsed under him. He tried to push forward, tried to keep running, but his body wouldn't listen. The pain was unbearable. He tumbled down, hitting the dirt hard. Gasps filled the stadium. The race stopped. Medics rushed onto the track. His jockey jumped off, trying to calm him. Thunder lay there, his leg trembling. He had never felt pain like this before. He didn't understand what was happening. He had always been strong, unstoppable. But now, he couldn't even stand. His racing career was over. The owners were furious. Not because he was hurt, but because he could no longer win races for them. In their eyes, he was no longer valuable. He had gone from being a champion to a burden in just a few seconds. They didn't care that he had given them everything, every ounce of strength he had. They only cared about what he could no longer do. At first, they tried to sell him, but no one wanted an injured racehorse. Then, they considered putting him down. But one stable worker, an old man named Charlie, couldn't bear to let that happen. Charlie had taken care of Thunder since he was a foal. He had watched him grow, train, and become a champion. He knew that Thunder was more than just a racehorse. He had heart. He had a will to fight. So, Charlie begged the owners to let him take Thunder. Surprisingly, they agreed. They had no use for him anymore, so why not? And just like that, Thunder's life changed forever. Instead of bright stadium lights and cheering crowds, he found himself in a quiet, peaceful farm far away from the racetrack. The place was nothing like his old world. There were no schedules, no races, no trainers yelling instructions. Just open fields, a small barn, and Charlie. But Thunder wasn't happy. He didn't understand this new life. He didn't know who he was without racing. His leg had healed, but it was weak. He couldn't run the way he used to. He couldn't feel the wind rushing past him, couldn't hear the crowd screaming his name. For the first time in his life, he felt lost. Charlie tried to help him adjust. He spoke to him softly, brushed his coat, fed him by hand. But Thunder barely responded. He stood by the fence, staring into the distance, as if waiting for someone to take him back to the track. Then, one day, something changed. Charlie's grandson, Ethan, came to visit. Ethan was a quiet, shy boy. He had just turned 8, and like Thunder, he was struggling to find his place. He had moved to a new town, started a new school, but he didn't fit in. The other kids didn't talk to him. He felt alone. The moment he saw Thunder, something clicked. He walked up to the fence, watching the horse with wide eyes. Thunder looked back at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, Ethan reached out his hand. Thunder could have turned away. He could have ignored him, just like he ignored everything else. But instead, he stepped closer. And just like that, a bond was formed. Every day, Ethan visited Thunder. He told him about school, about the kids who didn't talk to him, about how he wished things were different. He wasn't sure if Thunder understood, but he listened. And that was enough. Slowly, Thunder began to change. He started reacting to Ethan's voice, moving closer when the boy arrived. He no longer stood by the fence, lost in old memories. Instead, he followed Ethan around, nudging him playfully, showing signs of his old self. And then, one morning, something incredible happened. Ethan arrived as usual, but instead of just talking, he climbed onto Thunder's back. Charlie rushed forward, worried. "Be careful," he warned. But something in Thunder's eyes said, "It's okay." Ethan held on, his small hands gripping Thunder's manner. And then, with slow, careful steps, Thunder began to walk. For the first time in a long time, he felt purpose again. Not as a racehorse, not as a champion, but as a friend. Days turned into weeks, and Thunder and Ethan became inseparable. Ethan grew more confident, more talkative. He made a few friends at school, though Thunder always remained his closest. The horse was no longer the broken racer that stood by the fence, waiting for a past that wouldn't return. He had found something new, something even better. But neither of them knew that soon, Thunder's true test was coming. And it would change both their lives forever. For a while, Thunder believed he could still be the same horse he once was. Even after the injury, a part of him refused to accept that his racing days were over. He had spent years being a champion, and now, just because of one bad race, everything had changed. It didn't feel real. The days after his fall were a blur. He remembered lying in the dirt, his leg throbbing, the sound of the crowd fading into shocked silence. He remembered his jockey standing over him, whispering words he couldn't understand, his voice heavy with regret. Then came the trainers, the vets, the endless prodding and examining. The whispers of the owners. "He's finished. There's no point in keeping him. He won't make us money anymore." Thunder didn't fully understand their words, but he understood their tone. He had been their pride and joy, the horse that won them trophies, the one they bet all their money on. But now, he was nothing to them. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough to end his career. His front leg had taken too much strain. Even after healing, he would never run the same way again. The trainers didn't waste time trying to rehabilitate him. They didn't see the point. The days that followed were lonely. Thunder was kept in a stall away from the other racehorses. His bandaged leg ached, but the pain of being ignored hurt even more. The stable workers no longer looked at him with admiration. The jockeys who once praised him barely glanced his way. The owners, the same people who had celebrated him like a king, had already moved on to the next promising colt. And then, one evening, he overheard something that made his heart pound. "What are we going to do with him?" one of the owners asked. "Sell him, if we can," another replied. "If not, you know the other option." The other option. Thunder may not have understood every word, but he felt the weight of what they meant. Racehorses who were no longer useful often didn't get a second chance. He had seen it happen before. Horses who failed to perform were quietly taken away, never to return. He didn't want to be next. But no matter how much he wanted to fight, he couldn't run anymore. He couldn't prove he was still worth something. He was trapped, powerless, waiting for a decision to be made about his fate. Then came Charlie. Unlike the others, Charlie didn't look at him with disappointment. He didn't see a broken horse. He saw the same strong spirit that had always been there. When Charlie pleaded with the owners to let him take Thunder, they didn't even hesitate. To them, it was a relief. One less burden. They didn't care where Thunder went, as long as they didn't have to deal with him anymore. And just like that, the doors to the racetrack closed forever. Thunder was loaded onto a trailer, the same kind that had once taken him to championships. But this time, there were no cheering fans waiting at the end of the journey. Only silence. The truck rumbled forward, carrying him away from the only life he had ever known. As the racetrack faded in the distance, Thunder lowered his head. He wasn't just leaving a place. He was leaving behind who he used to be. The first few days at Charlie's farm were confusing for Thunder. Everything was different. The air smelled of fresh grass instead of dirt and sweat, the ground was soft instead of hard-packed track, and there was no sound of a starting bell, no crowds, no rushing hooves. For the first time in years, there was no pressure to win. But Thunder didn't know what to do with this new life. He spent hours standing by the fence, staring at the open fields, his ears twitching at the distant sounds of birds instead of cheering spectators. The other horses roamed freely, grazing, rolling in the grass, playing with each other. Thunder didn't join them. He didn't understand how. Charlie didn't rush him. He simply sat with him. Every morning, Charlie would come to the fence, lean against it, and talk to Thunder. His voice was calm, patient, familiar. He spoke about his day, about the farm, about how he used to watch Thunder race. He never asked anything from him, never forced him to move or interact. At first, Thunder ignored him. He was used to people talking at him, not to him. Trainers gave orders. Jockeys expected results. Owners cared about numbers. But Charlie, he just wanted to be there. Then one day, Charlie brought an apple. Thunder had eaten apples before, but they were always tossed to him without a second thought. This time, Charlie held it out, waiting. Thunder hesitated. Was this a trick? Was Charlie expecting something in return? But when he finally reached forward and took a bite, Charlie just smiled. See? No rush. No rules. Just you and me, buddy. That was the moment something shifted. Over the next few days, Thunder found himself looking forward to Charlie's visits. He started moving closer on his own, standing near the fence when Charlie arrived. When Charlie brought a brush, Thunder let him stroke his coat without flinching. When Charlie led him to the open pasture, Thunder followed, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. For the first time since his injury, he wasn't just an athlete. He wasn't a disappointment, a failed investment, a useless burden. He was a horse. Charlie never made him feel weak for being slow. He never expected him to be what he once was. He accepted Thunder as he was. And that changed everything. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky golden, Charlie sat on the fence, looking out over the fields. You know, Thunder, he said softly, not all races are about speed. Some are about heart. Thunder didn't understand the words, but he felt their meaning. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel broken. He felt free. The sky had been clear all day, but by evening, dark clouds rolled in, swallowing the last light of the sun. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of rain. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending a shiver through the fields. Thunder stood near the stable, ears twitching as he watched the horizon. He could feel it coming. Animals always sensed storms before they arrived. The wind carried a warning, a shift in the air that sent unease through Thunder's body. The other horses had already taken shelter, their nervous whinnies echoing from the barn. But Thunder remained outside, watching, waiting. Charlie came running across the field, his jacket flapping as he hurried to secure the stable doors. Come on, buddy, let's get you inside, he called, patting Thunder's neck. Thunder hesitated. He didn't fear storms, not like he feared the racetrack, the injuries, the judgment, but something about this night felt different. Still, he trusted Charlie. With a final glance at the darkening sky, he let Charlie lead him into the barn. The storm hit fast. Rain poured down in thick sheets, pounding against the roof. Thunder flinched at the sound of thunder cracking overhead, the deep rumble vibrating through his chest. Wind howled through the trees, rattling the stable doors. The other horses stomped their hooves, shifting restlessly in their stalls. Charlie moved quickly, checking every door, making sure everything was secure. It's gonna be a rough one, he muttered to himself. Then, a scream. A sharp, terrified cry cut through the storm, barely audible over the wind and rain. Charlie's head snapped up. Thunder's ears shot forward. Another scream. A child. Charlie bolted for the door. Thunder surged forward too, but the stable door held him back. He whinnied loudly, pacing anxiously as Charlie ran into the storm. Rain soaked his clothes in seconds, but he didn't stop. Thunder couldn't see where he was going, but he could hear the desperation in the child's cries. Then, through the open barn door, he caught sight of the river. It was swollen from the heavy rain, its waters raging wildly. The current was faster than usual, angry and unforgiving. And in the middle of it, a small boy, struggling against the pull. Charlie ran toward the riverbank, but the mud was deep, making it nearly impossible to move fast. The boy flailed, his arms barely keeping his head above water. He wouldn't last much longer. Thunder stomped his hooves, nostrils flaring. He could feel the urgency, the life-or-death moment unfolding just beyond his reach. His muscles tensed, heart pounding. And then, he moved. Without thinking, Thunder reared up and kicked the stall door open. It swung wildly, slamming against the wall, but he was already galloping through the rain. His injured leg protested, but he ignored it. Charlie barely had time to react before Thunder charged past him, straight toward the river. Thunder, no. But it was too late. Thunder didn't stop. He pushed through the mud, his hooves sinking deep but never hesitating. The river roared in front of him, the water cold and violent, but none of it mattered. He leaped in. The current hit him like a wall, nearly knocking the air from his lungs. Water rushed around him, pulling, twisting. But Thunder knew how to fight. He wasn't the fastest anymore, but he was strong. He pushed forward, kicking hard, his head barely above the surface. The boy was just ahead, his tiny hands reaching, his face pale with exhaustion. Thunder surged forward. The boy's fingers slipped once, twice, before finally gripping Thunder's maner with the last of his strength. Thunder turned, fighting the current with every ounce of power in his body. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he swam, pulling the child back toward the shore. Charlie was there, wading into the water, arms outstretched. "Come on, buddy, you got this." Thunder pushed harder, every muscle screaming in protest. Then, solid ground. Charlie grabbed the boy, lifting him to safety. Thunder, exhausted, collapsed onto the muddy bank, his chest heaving. Rain poured down, but all he could hear was the sound of the boy coughing, alive. Charlie knelt beside him, hands shaking. "You saved him," he whispered. Thunder closed his eyes, his body aching. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel broken. He felt whole. The rescue had changed everything. Thunder was no longer just an injured racehorse, a forgotten champion. To Charlie, to the town, and most of all, to himself, he was a hero. The story of how he had saved the drowning boy had spread like wildfire. People came from all over to see him, to touch the horse who had braved a raging river to save a life. But while everyone saw a hero, Thunder knew the truth. His body was still weak. His legs still ached. And though the world had forgiven him for his failures on the track, he had not forgiven himself. Charlie knew this. "You still don't feel like you've won, do you?" Charlie said one evening, rubbing Thunder's neck as they stood by the fence, watching the sun set over the fields. Thunder snorted softly, shifting his weight. "You need one last challenge," Charlie said, almost to himself. "Something to prove, once and for all, that you're not just a racehorse. That you're more." Thunder flicked his ears forward. And that's how the idea was born. Charlie had heard about a cross-country endurance race happening just a few towns away. It wasn't like the racetrack. It wasn't about pure speed or crossing the finish line first. It was about stamina, determination, and trust between horse and rider. The course was brutal. Miles of rough terrain, unpredictable weather, and obstacles designed to test both strength and heart. It was the kind of challenge that most former racehorses wouldn't even attempt. But Thunder was different. It took weeks to prepare. At first, Thunder struggled. The long runs through uneven ground, the deep mud that pulled at his legs, the steep hills that made every step feel heavier. It was a whole new world. Unlike the smooth, controlled racetrack, there were no clear paths here. Every step had to be calculated. Every movement had to be intentional. And the worst part? His leg. Some days, it held up fine. Others, it buckled beneath him, sending him to his knees. The old injury wasn't just a physical wound, it was a mental one. Every time Thunder stumbled, the doubt crept in. What if he couldn't do this? What if he wasn't built for this kind of race? But Charlie never let him quit. "Pain isn't the same as weakness," Charlie would say, pressing a hand against Thunder's sweaty neck. "We're in this together, one step at a time." And so, they trained. Thunder learned to pace himself. He learned how to navigate rocky trails, how to push through deep water, how to trust his instincts instead of relying on speed alone. And slowly, he changed. He wasn't just an ex-racehorse anymore. He was a fighter. The morning of the race arrived cold and grey. The sky hung heavy with the promise of rain. Riders and their horses gathered near the starting line, their breaths misting in the chilly air. The nervous energy was electric, hooves shifting, nostrils flaring, tails flicking. The competition was fierce. Some of these horses were trained specifically for endurance racing, built for this exact kind of challenge. Thunder wasn't. But he had something they didn't. Charlie stood beside him, adjusting the reins, checking the straps. "No matter what happens, we finish this race, okay?" His voice was calm but firm. "We don't need to win. We just need to prove that you're still standing." Thunder flicked his ears back, listening. And then, the gun fired. Thunder launched forward. The first part of the course was a test of speed. Flat, open ground where riders could gain an early lead before the real obstacles began. The younger horses bolted ahead, stretching their strides, their riders urging them on. Charlie didn't push Thunder too hard. This wasn't about winning the first stretch. Thunder paced himself, his body falling into rhythm. The wind pressed against him, his muscles working in sync with Charlie's movements. He could feel the power in his legs, the pulse of energy that had been missing for so long. Then came the first challenge, a steep, muddy incline. Other horses slowed, some slipping as they struggled to climb. The rain from the night before had turned the ground slick, making every step a risk. Charlie leaned forward, his grip steady. "We've got this, buddy. Easy now." Thunder dug in. His hooves sank into the mud, his legs burning as he pulled himself upward. The weight of Charlie on his back was a reminder he wasn't doing this alone. Step by step, they climbed, his breath coming in sharp huffs. Halfway up, a horse beside them lost its footing. The rider yanked at the reins, trying to keep control, but the horse slid backward, hooves scrambling. For a moment, Thunder hesitated. But then, instinct kicked in. He pressed forward, driving himself up the last few feet. When they finally reached the top, Charlie let out a breathless laugh. "I knew you had it in you." But the hardest part was still ahead. The river crossing was next. As soon as Thunder saw the rushing water, he froze. It wasn't fear. It was memory. The sound, the movement, it was that night all over again. Charlie felt him stiffen. "You can do this," he murmured, rubbing Thunder's neck. "This time, you're crossing for yourself." The other horses plunged in, their riders urging them through the strong current. Some struggled, others fought against the pull of the water. Thunder took a breath, and then, he leaped forward. Water crashed around them. The cold hit like a shock, but he didn't stop. His hooves struck the riverbed, muscles burning as he pushed through the current. Charlie held steady, guiding him. Inch by inch, they moved. The memory of saving the boy flashed in Thunder's mind. The fear, the exhaustion, the moment he had chosen to fight instead of flee. And then, solid ground. They made it. Charlie grinned, patting Thunder's neck. "That's my boy." But the final test still remained. The last stretch of the race was a full-speed sprint. This was Thunder's territory. He had run races all his life. He had flown past crowds, pushed past limits. But this time, it wasn't about the crowd. It wasn't about a trophy. It wasn't about proving himself to the world. It was about proving himself to himself. Charlie gave him one last nudge. "Go." Thunder went. Pain didn't matter. The past didn't matter. All that mattered was this moment. The other horses charged forward, their strides powerful. But Thunder had something they didn't. He had heart. And sometimes, heart is enough. He didn't win first place. But he crossed that finish line, strong, unbroken, and free. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like a champion again. Thunder stood at the finish line, his chest heaving, his coat damp with sweat. His legs ached, his body was exhausted, but there was no pain greater than the one he had carried inside him for so long, the fear that he was no longer the horse he used to be. But as he stood there, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breaths, he realized something. He had done it. Charlie dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against the dirt as he stepped in front of Thunder, running a hand down his strong neck. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, breathing with him. And then, he did something Thunder hadn't seen him do before. His eyes glistened. "You did it, buddy," he finally whispered. Thunder let out a slow exhale, lowering his head toward Charlie's shoulder. It was not the same as standing in a racetrack's winner's circle. There was no golden trophy, no roaring applause. But somehow, this felt bigger. The crowd that had gathered around the finish line wasn't cheering in the way they would for a racehorse who had set records. Instead, they watched him with admiration, with respect. Even the riders who had finished before him looked on, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Not a single person had expected him to finish the race, let alone keep up with some of the strongest horses in the competition. They had seen racehorses like him before, ones who had lost their edge, who had been discarded by the racing world, left to fade away. But Thunder had just proven them all wrong. A few people approached Charlie after the race, offering compliments, asking about Thunder's story. Some of them had heard about the river rescue, about how this same horse had jumped into the floodwaters to save a child. They had thought it was just a story, an exaggeration. Now, they understood. Thunder wasn't just a retired racehorse. He was a survivor. As Charlie led him back toward the trailer, Thunder felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not the thrill of competition, not the pressure of needing to be the fastest. He felt content. For the first time since his injury, since the day he had fallen, he no longer felt like he was running from his past. He was walking toward his future. When they returned to the farm, things felt different. The air was the same, the field stretched out before him just as they always had. But something inside Thunder had shifted. He didn't go straight to the fence like he used to, staring out at the world beyond as if waiting for something. Instead, he walked freely into the pasture, letting the wind ruffle through his mane. Ethan was waiting for him, just like he always was. The boy's eyes lit up when he saw Thunder approaching. He ran to him, throwing his arms around the horse's neck. "You did it," Ethan said, his voice filled with pure excitement. Thunder lowered his head, nudging Ethan's shoulder gently. The boy giggled, stroking his face. Charlie leaned against the fence, watching them with a knowing smile. "I think he's finally home," he said softly. And for the first time in a long time, Thunder believed it too. Time passed, but Thunder's story never faded. If anything, it grew stronger, traveling beyond the farm, beyond the town, and into the hearts of people who had never even met him. It started with the race. Footage of the fallen racehorse's comeback spread quickly, making its way onto local news channels and social media. People couldn't believe it. A horse that had been written off, left behind, forgotten had just proven he still had something left to give. Then came the rescue story. Word got out about the day Thunder had jumped into the river, risking his own life to save a drowning child. It wasn't just horse lovers who were moved by it. People who had never even cared about racing or farm life found themselves drawn to his story. He wasn't just an animal, he was a symbol of strength, resilience, and second chances. Visitors started coming to the farm just to see him. Some were kids who had seen his story online, their eyes wide with admiration as they reached out to touch him. Others were older, people who had faced struggles of their own and saw something in Thunder's journey that inspired them to keep going. Ethan loved telling the story, standing beside Thunder with pride in his voice. "He's not just a racehorse," he'd say. "He's a fighter." Thunder became more than a retired champion. He became a legend. Schools invited Charlie and Ethan to speak about him, and soon, Thunder's story was being used in lessons about perseverance and kindness. Artists painted his image, writers told his tale, and people from all over sent letters and messages, thanking them for sharing such an incredible journey. But to Thunder, none of that mattered as much as the life he had now. He didn't need roaring crowds or flashing cameras. He didn't need trophies or ribbons. He had a home, a boy who loved him, and fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. He had peace. And as the sun set over the farm each evening, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and gold, Thunder stood tall, knowing that his story would live on forever, not just in the past, but in the hearts of everyone he had touched. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because heroes like Storm deserve to be remembered.